climate change and energy crisis. Before we proceed or before we define the climate change and energy crisis, we will first differentiate what is climate and weather. So weather is the day-to-day state of the atmosphere and its short-term variation in minutes to weeks. While climate is the average weather and usually refers to average weather conditions over long periods, at least seasons, but more often years or decades. And now we will proceed to what is climate change. So climate change is a change in the statistical distribution of weather patterns when that change lasts for an extended period of time. Global climate change has already had observable effects on the environment. Glaciers have shrunk, ice on rivers and lakes is breaking up earlier. Plant and animal ranges have shifted and trees are flowering sooner. Effects that scientists had predicted in the past would result from global climate change are now occurring. The global temperature rise, the shrinking ice sheets or loss of sea ice, accelerated sea level rise, and longer, more intense heat waves, water acidification, and extreme events. So 97% of climate scientists agree that climate warming trends over the past century are very likely due to human activities, and most of the leading scientific organizations worldwide have issued public statements endorsing this position. Okay, one manifestation of climate change is the global warming. So ano naman tong global warming na to? Okay, so global warming refers to the increase in the average temperature of the Earth's near surface air and oceans in recent decades and its projected continuation. In common usage, the term refers to recent warming and implies a human influence. Most of the observed increase in globally average temperature since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in greenhouse gas concentrations, which leads to warming of the surface and lower atmosphere by increasing the greenhouse effect. So natural phenomena such as the solar variation combined with volcanoes also produce greenhouse effect. So what's this greenhouse effect naman? Okay, so the greenhouse effect, idealized diagram showing the greenhouse effect, incoming visible solar radiation is absorbed by the Earth's surface to be re-emitted in the infrared region of the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay, so most of this re-emitted infrared radiation is absorbed by the atmosphere, maintaining the greenhouse effect. Okay, so now we'll proceed to the causes of climate change. Okay, yung unang-una dito is the human activities. Tayo. Okay, so humans influence climate change. Humans have been influencing the climate change or the climate since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Since then, the average world temperature has risen approximately 0.8 degrees Celsius. In Northwest Europe, including the Netherlands, the average temperature has risen by around 20 centimeters and most of the glaciers have shrunk dramatically. So up to 1950, the influence of nature was more important than human influence. After that, the pattern in the average world temperature can only be explained by factoring in the human influence. Even so, a slight decline in temperature did appear from the mid-40s to the mid-70s. It was linked to a dramatic increase in cooling aerosols from the post-war industrialization in the Western world. It was also caused by a mild decline in solar activity and some major volcanic eruptions in the second half of this period. So according to the latest IPCC report, it is more than likely 90% probability that most of the global warming in recent decades is attributed to the observed increase in greenhouse. Okay, so now next, we have the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, so paano naman to? The most well-known and most abundant greenhouse gas is the carbon dioxide. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is subject to the variation even without human intervention. So the carbon cycle causes an exchange of carbon dioxide between the biosphere and the ocean on the one hand and the atmosphere on the other. So vast amount of carbon dioxide is also released by the burning of fossil fuels. There is incontrovertible evidence that the carbon dioxide concentration in the air has been so high in the planet's surface from being lost into space. Okay, so the human-induced buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is known as the enhanced greenhouse effect on anthropogenic climate change. Okay, so next is the aerosols and greenhouse gases. So aerosols are less well known than greenhouse gases. Aerosols, dust particles. So itong aerosols natin, they are dust particles which in addition to the carbon dioxide are released into the atmosphere in the large quantities when wood and fossil fuels are burned. So some aerosols have a cooling effect on the climate, others have a warming effect. On balance, they have a cooling rather than a warming effect. But no one can give a clear idea of the magnitude, okay, because we still do not understand how aerosols influence the occurrence and characteristics of clouds. Okay, so natural phenomena, greenhouse gases and aerosols create an imbalance in the incoming and outgoing radiation in the atmosphere. This process is known as the radiative forcing. When the Earth heats up, the shortwave radiation from the sun that enters the atmosphere is greater than the long-wave radiation that exits the atmosphere. The temperature changes on Earth will not stop until the radiation balance is restored. So given the immense capacity of oceans to absorb heat, it will take a long time to strike a new balance. So those are the causes of climate change. The human activities, the concentration of carbon dioxide, and the aerosols and greenhouse gases. Now, what consequences do we see? Okay, so first, we have the climate change and forests. Most people know how vital forests are. They soak up carbon dioxide and help regulate the world's climate. They are also home to countless plant and animals. Ano na lang kaya mangyayari kapag ang isang forest is masusunog or makakalbo, just like the um, Amazon, ba yung na ano, nasunog, yung mga ganon. So, magkakaroon ng imbalance na dyan. So, we have, okay, so, let us work with communities, local governments, and business to ensure the world's forests are protected. Noon, nakakakita pa tayo ng mga fireflies, but now, bihira na lang because hindi na polluted na yung surroundings natin. Okay, next. How about naman kay sa climate change and water? Okay, climate change is having serious and unpredictable impacts on the world's water systems through more flooding and droughts. Okay, ngayon itong flooding nararanasan na natin nowadays. Ang pinakamatindi na naranasan natin is in sa may part ng Visayas. Visayas ba? Si Yolanda, right? Oh, Samar. Okay, here naman sa Cagayan, which is the Lawin. Okay, so lahat ng human activities naman, lahat ng ginagawa natin sa nature is bumabalik sa atin. So it's impacting on rivers and lakes which supply drinking water for people and animals and are vital resource for farming and industry. And it threatens food chains in our ocean and seas which sustain a large proportion of life on Earth. So sa amin, okay, kapag summer na, nawawalan na mostly or some part of areas in our barangay is nawawalan sila ng tubig sa kanilang mga pump well. Okay? Next. So, how about naman in climate change and polar regions? So, recent data have shown that Arctic summer sea ice is melting faster than predicted. Sa Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned that the impacts of climate change in the polar regions over the next 100 years will exceed impacts forecast for other regions and will have globally significant consequences. Okay, next, climate change and wildlife. Okay, so for endangered species such as the orangutan in Borneo and Indonesia, which are already at risk because of the deforestation, forest conversion, and illegal hunting. One of the first effects of climate change is likely to be food shortages caused by unusual rainfall patterns. They are just one of the many species that will be affected. Okay, so yun yung mga consequences na nangyayari na due to the climate change. Next, how will we address climate change? Okay, so ito, forgo fossil fuel. What do we mean or how do we forgo fossil fuels? So the first challenge is eliminating the burning of coal, oil, and eventually the natural gas. This is perhaps the most daunting challenge as denizens of richer nations literally eat, wear, work, play, and even sleep on the products made from such fossilized sunshine. And citizens of developing nations want and arguably deserve the same comforts, which are largely thanks to the energy stored in such fuels. Second is infrastructure upgrade. Okay, buildings worldwide contribute around one-third of greenhouse gas emissions, even though investing in thicker insulation and other cost-effective and temperature-regulating steps can save money in the long run. So electric grids are at capacity or overload, but power demands continue to rise. And bad roads can lower the fuel economy of even the most efficient vehicle. So investing in new infrastructure or radically upgrading existing highways and transmission lines would help cut greenhouse gas emissions and drive economic growth in developing countries. Next, move closer to work. Okay, bakit kaya move closer to work? So transportation is the second leading source of greenhouse gas emission. So in the Philippines, factories and transportation facilities contribute much to gas emissions, but it does not have to be that way. So one way to dramatically curtail transportation fuel needs is to move closer to work, use mass transit or switch to walking, cycling, or some other mode of transport that does not require anything other than human energy. Okay, so para mahirap ano to. So, move closer to work. Hindi naman natin na ma-predict yung trabaho natin or hindi naman natin ginusto na lumayo sa ano natin sa bahay or ano natin. Okay, so next we have the consume less. The easiest way to cut back on greenhouse gas emissions is simply to buy less stuff, whether by foregoing an automobile or employing a reusable grocery bag. Cutting back on consumption results in few fossil fuels being burned to extract, produce, and ship products around the world. So, itong reusable grocery bag naman kasi masyadong matigas ang ulo ng mga tao, still plastic pa rin ang mga ginagamit. So, we can use the eco bag naman kapag pumunta tayo ng plaza. And also, yung paggamit ng mga straw, ganon, kailangan din i-lesser din yan. So, we have to consume less. Next, be efficient. Okay, so potentially simpler and even a bigger impact can be made by doing more with less. Citizens of many developed countries are profligate waste resource of energy, whether by speeding in a guzzling sports utility vehicle or leaving the lights on when not in a room. Okay, conserve energy, sinabi natin. Next is eat smart, go vegetarian. Corn, okay, so corn grown in the world requires barrels of oil for the fertilizer to grow and the diesel fuel to harvest and transport it. So some grocery stores stock organic produce that do not require such fertilizer, but it's often shipped from halfway across the globe. So also meat, whether beef, chicken, or pork, requires pounds of feed to produce a pound of protein. Okay, next, importantly tayo mga ba, stop cutting down trees. Okay, so pwede lang naman mag-cut ng trees as long as papalitan natin siya. So every year, 30 million acres of forest trees are cut down. Timber harvesting in the tropics alone contributes 1.5 billion metric tons of carbon to the atmosphere. That represents 20% of human-made greenhouse gas emissions and a source that could be avoided relatively easily. Next, unplug. Okay, so believe it or not, Filipinos spend more money on electricity to power devices when off than when on. Televisions, stereo equipment, computers, battery charges, and a host of other gadgets and appliances consume more energy when seemingly switched off. So unplug them instead pag hindi ginagamit. Kaya minsan prone tayo sa mga fire, sa mga ganyan sa bahay natin kasi hindi natin ina-unplug pag hindi natin ginagamit. Next, one child. Ano itong one child? There are at least 8 billion people living today, a number that is predicted by United Nations to grow to at least 9.7 billion by 2050. The UN Environment Program estimates that it requires 54 acres to sustain an average human being today. So food, clothing, and other resources extracted from the planet, continuing such population growth seems unsustainable. So masyadong mahirap naman 'tong pinapagawa nila na one child. So we have one child policy in China ata yan. Okay. So next, future fuels. So replacing fossil fuels may prove to be a great challenge of the 21st century. Many contenders exist, ranging from ethanol derived from crops to hydrogen electrolyzed out of water, but all of them have some drawbacks too, and none are immediately available at the scale needed. Okay, so ayan, yung ilan ba? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10. Okay, 10 na pwede natin gawin to address the climate change. Next, energy crisis. So, energy crisis, it is the concern that the world's demands on the limited natural resources that are used to power industrial society are diminishing as the demand rises. Okay, so energy crisis refers to any significant decrease in the supply of energy resources to an economy in a certain time and place and has affected electric power supply and fuel machineries and vehicles. So we have the causes of energy crisis. First is the overconsumption. The energy crisis is a result of many different strains on our natural resources, not just one. There is a strain on fossil fuels such as oil, gas, and coal due to overconsumption, which then in turn can put a strain on our water and oxygen resources by causing pollution. Second is the overpopulation. Ito na yung sinasabi ng in addressing the climate change na one child. Okay? Another cause of the crisis has been the steady increase in the world's population and its demand for fuel and products. No matter what type of food or products you can choose to use, from fair trade and organic to those made from petroleum products in a sweatshop, not one of them is made or transported without a significant drain on our energy resources. Next is the poor infrastructure. Aging infrastructure of power generating equipment is yet another reason for energy shortage. Most of the energy producing firms keep on using outdated equipment that restricts the production of energy. It is the responsibility of utilities to keep on upgrading the infrastructure and set a high standard of performance. And lastly, we have the unexplored renewable energy options. Renewable energy still remains unused in most of the countries. Most of the energy comes from the non-renewable sources like coal. It still remains the top choice to produce energy, unless we give renewable energy a serious thought. the problem of energy crisis cannot be solved. Renewable energy sources can reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and also helps to reduce the greenhouse gas emission. Okay, so we need to use alternative energy sources. So that will be tackled on the next topic. Okay, so according to Mark Twain, what puts us into trouble is not what we do not know, it's what we know for sure that just ain't so. O yan lang yung paiwan na saying sa inyo. So that's all about for climate change and energy crisis.